This subject was definitely a challenge for me to understand. And when it first began, I made the mistake of just buying whatever telescope I assumed would be good for astrophotography. And boy, was I wrong. There are many different factors that you have to pay attention to when you're choosing your first telescope. And when I was personally watching YouTube to figure out which one was going to be the best choice for me, I honestly got super overwhelmed. So I'm going to break it down for you little by little to make it as easy as possible to understand. There are generally two types of astrophotographers, no in between. There are visual astronomers and astrophotographers. Usually, people begin as visual astronomers and move on to the hobby of astrophotography later. So let's discuss visual astronomy. For visual astronomy, you're really not going to have to pay attention to too many details. If you only plan on viewing things such as the moon or planets, then it would be recommended for you to get a telescope with a higher focal length. Focal ratio doesn't play as much of a role in this form of astronomy, since you won't be taking long exposures. Focal length directly impacts the magnification of your telescope, directly impacting how well you can see the details on planets and the details on either the sun or the surface of the moon. If you don't want to pay too much money on your first visual telescope, I definitely recommend owning Refractor and Schmidt-Cassegrain style telescopes. And I would say to lean more towards a Dobsonian or Newtonian reflector telescope. These types of telescopes will give you the aperture and the focal length that you need at a fraction of the price that you would pay for a refractor. However, if you plan on using your telescope for astrophotography, everything changes. It would be more wise to focus on the aperture of your telescope rather than the focal length. A wider aperture allows you to collect more light within a certain amount of time, which allows you to take shorter or less exposures to get a nearly noise-free image. If you don't want to pay a crazy amount of money for an expensive mount, I would definitely recommend that you stick to a shorter focal length refractor to begin with. The same thing would be applied to if you plan on using a DSLR camera and lens rather than a telescope. If you plan on taking pictures of deep sky objects, definitely make sure that you have a larger aperture instead of paying too much attention to focal length. As we discussed in the previous episode, there are many different forms of astrophotography, ranging from solar imaging, comets, planets, and even space dust. But each of these different forms of astrophotography would require its own style of telescope. But how do you know which kind of telescope to choose? Let's begin with solar photography. There is actually a unique style of telescope that allows you to view things like solar flares and solar prominences, and that is the hydrogen alpha telescope. These telescopes are made by several different companies. The best known ones made by LUNT Solar Systems, Daystar, and Coronado. By the way, all of the links to all the telescopes mentioned will be included in the description of the video, so feel free to check it out for yourself. What about for deep sky objects like galaxies in particular? Apart from galaxies that are closer by like the Triangulum Galaxy and the Andromeda Galaxy, galaxy shots close up generally require a larger amount of focal length and a wider aperture. For this reason, it will be better that you use a reflector, refractor, or catadioptric telescope. For up-close galaxy imaging, you're going to want to make sure you definitely have a higher budget, because for that, you want to make sure you have a nice heavy-duty mount and a telescope with a high focal length but a good focal ratio, which is really hard to find at a low price. The only issue with scopes like the reflector scopes is that sometimes it can be difficult for beginners to understand how to collimate their telescope, which is a requirement from time to time. And large aperture refractors would be out of the budget for most beginners. But what about nebula? Personally, I will always have to recommend refractor telescopes as a go-to telescope for nebulas, especially for beginners. The great thing about refractors is that because the majority of nebula that beginners would be imaging would be the largest and the brightest, you can still get a good quality refractor without spending too much money. Of course, you wouldn't be able to get a refractor with a large aperture, but even with a smaller aperture, you can get some great images. For example, SharpStar released Askar 71F flat field telescope, which is a great deal for its price. I actually did a review video on this specific telescope, so make sure that you go ahead and check it out for yourself. And no, I'm not affiliated with SharpStar, although I wish I was, so everything that's mentioned in this review is 100% honest. This specific telescope goes to show that when paired with the right camera, you can achieve astrophotography images that are unimaginably good. Some other refractor telescopes that I would recommend to beginners would be the ZWO FF65 APO telescope, the Svbony SV550 80ED refractor, And again, as mentioned, the Askar 71F flat field refractor. One more thing about refractor telescopes. It is very important that you pay attention to the optics on them. If it's only a doublet APO, you're likely to experience more chromatic aberration, which is a blue halo around your stars. This can be a very difficult thing to post-process out of your images at times, especially, again, for beginners. I'd recommend that you purchase a triplet or quadruplet APO refractor, even though it can be a little bit more pricey, and all of the telescopes that were previously mentioned are, in fact, triplet or quadruplet APOs. There are many numbers that you may see when you're looking at the specs of a telescope, and seeing so many different numbers as a beginner could confuse you. But let me break it down for you. The three most important things you need to pay attention when choosing your telescope, as mentioned earlier, are the focal length, aperture, and the focal ratio of the telescope. For nebulas, you'd want a focal length less than 450 millimeters. And for galaxies, it would be recommended that you get a telescope with a focal length more than 500 millimeters. Of course, if you have a telescope that's less than 500 millimeters, that doesn't mean that you can't photograph galaxies. They just wouldn't be very high resolution, close-up, detailed images. For aperture size, anything under 50 millimeters wouldn't be recommended for astrophotography, unless you're just not imaging deep space, because it simply just wouldn't let enough light in for the focal length that you would need for astro imaging. Of course, if you're trying to image just the Milky Way galaxy in general, sure, 50 millimeters would be a great aperture size. And to get good contrast from the deep sky object against the night sky, aim towards getting a telescope with a focal ratio less than f8. f8 telescopes and higher are generally very slow and is going to require you to take a lot more time imaging than you would like. I'll be making another episode on how to understand focal ratios later in the season. And if you don't know how to find the focal ratio, maybe they don't list it on the website that you're looking at, simply divide the focal length by the aperture size and that will be your focal ratio. There were several points made in this video. Did you catch what they were? Always pay attention to focal ratio when you're choosing your telescope. That's probably one of the most important things. Depending on what you plan on imaging with your telescope, make sure that you pay close attention to the focal length of the telescope itself. And always pay attention to how many lenses are inside of the telescope if you're choosing a refractor. But also when choosing your telescope, remember to choose a mount that can handle the weight of that specific telescope you're looking at buying. But which mount should you use? Let's find out in the next episode.